Good morning. My name is Ian Olivo-Reed, and it is my privilege to serve as your worship associate today. In fact, this is my last time. I'm very happy to hand the mic over to Susan for February. I'm looking forward to it. And I just have to say that I think I mentioned that I teach at a local college, and I often, when I talk to groups like this, they're usually between the ages of 18 and 21. And there's something about being an 18 or 19-year-old in that you don't think that the speaker is actually looking at you. So there's always this expressions of boredom and suppressed pain. But I can assure you that is not what I see and not what I've seen. I'm often visited by a vivid memory. I'm about 5 or 6 years old, and my older brothers, parents, and extended family are gathering for dinner at my grandparents'. The house is deep in the Wisconsin North Woods on the edge of a small lake. Loons cry, piercing the shadows among the limbs of birch trees that glow white in the light of a large dining room window. Garrison Keeler plays bluegrass in the kitchen, and a pine wood fire sighs and shifts. The adults talk a kind of progressive politics once dominant in the state of Robert Lafayette, trustbusters and union supporters. Despite its warmth, these kinds of memories conceal our shortcomings, and my family's weakness was a Germanic aversion to sentimentality, to the point that what should be said isn't. Despite our problems, my family has somehow maintained a kind of covenant of good relations. We have difficulty expressing our love and our sadness, yet we remain bound and loyal. In 2009, I moved with my partner, Chanel, and then our 1-year-old daughter, Luciana, to Southern California for work. In a strange suburbia and without family, we sought community and familiarity. We found Tapestry. I've not been a member for a long time, but long enough to see disagreement and division diminish us so that only half the seats of our sanctuary are filled. Considering a rainy day, look at where we're at now. Today, indeed, our community is effervescent, but we would be naive to believe that conflict will never return. For this reason, I want to make the case that perhaps the most important step that this congregation has taken in the last 8-10 years or so was not to move to a new location, although I do like our green patio. Additionally, I cannot even say that gaining a skilled, caring, and settled minister may matter the most. Rather, I think we should take our greatest pride in the covenant of right relations, voted into existence during our annual congregational town hall about 3 years ago. I'm sure you've seen this. It's printed in the back of our Sunday's order of service. But you may not know that connected to this oath is a small team of committed members and a thoughtful multi-step process in resolving conflict when it arises. And I don't think it's been used much lately, which is great. This month we've talked about what nonviolence is, including its limits, how we might at least partially climb the mountain with the peak of ahimsa, insist on the truth or satyagraha. This morning we will turn back to some of the familiar people and stories of nonviolence rooted in our long Unitarian past and ask what they mean for us today. But let's not let this month pass without considering the valuable steps we've taken towards nonviolence in our own community. Covenants only last with reaffirmation, so I'm going to ask to do something a little unusual and perhaps a little bold, and to ask us to read the covenant of right relations aloud. If possible, I'd like to just begin, and then if everyone could join me with the bolded, bulleted text in italics. This is on the back of our order of service under Tapestry Covenant of Right Relations. So, in pursuit of the ideals of a beloved community which supports our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles and to promote constructive relations among ourselves at Tapestry, we covenant to treat one another with respect and civility, live with integrity and responsibility, cultivate openness and transparency, make official decisions through the democratic process. Words that sing. Thank you. We come together in community, supporting and encouraging each other on our spiritual journeys, affirming the importance not only of tolerance, but of acceptance, compassion, and open-mindedness. Our various groups and events reflect our vision of being a transformational home for liberal spirituality and a dynamic community leader in Orange County and beyond. And now, Free Clark will light our flaming chalice, the central symbol of our Unitarian Universalist heritage. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lit the flame within us.
Come in and sit by the fire of our chalice, and let us share stories. Let me hear your tales of far-off lands, and I'll tell you of my travels. Share your experiences of the holy with us, and I'll tell you that which I find divine. We would hear your stories of grief and sorrow as readily as those of joy and laughter, for there's time and a place and a hearing for all the stories of the world. Stories are the breath and the word of the Spirit of life, that power that we name love. Come, sit by our fire, for it is warm, and there are seats for all. Come and share what fills your heart, what engages your mind, and what resides in your soul. Come, let us worship together. And now, if our young or young at heart want to come and gather on the carpet up front, Karen has a story to share with us.
So glad you're all here this morning, and today we're going to learn about Pearl Moskowitz's Last Stand. What? Yeah, what do you think that's going to be about? Pearl Moskowitz. Pearl Moskowitz had seen a lot of change on Ginkgo Street. In fact, she could remember when it was a plain street called Smith, after the man who paid for the signs, Mr. Smith. But soon after the Berwarskis and Plotniks and Krakow started arriving from Russia, there was a big change. Bella Moskowitz, Pearl's mother, gave a petition to the mayor asking for trees to be planted on the block. Flowering trees. Who could argue with Bella? He renamed the street for good measure. So Pearl and her sisters, Selma, Velma, and Wilma, grew tall and blossomed next to nature's own. One fall, the prettiest ginkgo tree of all was struck down by lightning, and the sisters rushed out, crying, to gather the orphan leaves. But the other ginkgos thrived, and one summer day, Velma got married under the green canopy of Stewie Feinberg's tree. Time passed, and the names on the mailboxes changed to old presidents like Washington, Lincoln, and Jefferson. When Pearl sat out in the shade of the trees with her neighbors, she began to serve mint tea and lemonade, Southern style. Her friends called her Pool and Sugar, and Pearl only minded a little when workers cleared away Minnie Hamilton's tree to make way for a bus stop. That made it easier for her sisters to visit. So more time went by, and families named Pina, Orantes, and Diego moved in. They taught Pearl to dance to a Latin beat, and they let her take a swing at the piñata for little Roy Diego's birthday party. Piñata. You like piñatas? But one day, a new mayor made a proclamation. "No more slums," he said. "Out with the old and in with the new." Bulldozers knocked down old townhouses and took many of the trees with them. Pearl watched from her window and wished her mother were still alive. Bella would have stopped them. By the time the Chens and the Keys became Pearl's neighbors, there was only one tree left, but it was a beauty, broad, strong, and deeply lined, not unlike Pearl herself. All the grandmas would gather under the tree to play cards and have picnics, matzo balls and steamed dumplings, challah and jalapenos. Then one day it happened. Pearl was sitting under the tree reading to Sue Lynn and Valerie from next door when a truck drove up. A tall, thin man with thin lips and a thin tie got out. "Sorry, folks, but you'll have to move," he said in a thin voice. "I have orders from the electric company to cut this tree down. New wiring, regulations." Then he started laying out his tools. Now, as I said, Pearl had seen a lot of change on Ginkgo Street, but she was not about to sit idly by while they cut down the last ginkgo. She stood up. "Excuse me," she said. "You look like a nice boy. Are you eating enough?" The man looked up. "Well, I did skip lunch," he said. "How about a nosh then?" "Girls," said Pearl. "Knishes," shouted Sue Lynn. "And bagels," shouted Valerie. "With plenty of cream cheese and lox," said Pearl. And she meant it. Out came plates, trays. Before he knew it, the man had tuna and kasha, some scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, a cheese plate, and Pearl's noodle pudding. So good and full of cinnamon, it could stop you in your tracks. Cold. The electrician was so stuffed he could barely move, let alone chop down a tree. But the next day he was back. Pearl, Mrs. Char, Mrs. Washington, and Mrs. Guerrero were playing canasta under the tree. "Okay, ladies, no snacks today. I mean business," said the man. Pearl smiled. "Such a handsome boy," she whispered loudly to Mrs. Char, "and absolutely identical to my nephew Joseph." Pearl pulled out her wallet and opened it to the section for photos. "The resemblance is remarkable." The man couldn't help looking over Pearl's shoulder. "Oh, honey, sit. We've got lots of pictures." The ladies snapped open their wallets into long plastic accordion folds, and with each one a story. Let me tell you, no tree got chopped down that day. But would you believe this man came back for a third try the very next morning? "This time, no tricks," the man announced. Pearl looked up from fixing Ronnie Guerrera's bike. No one else was around. "All right," said Pearl, "you leave me no choice." Very carefully, she removed the long chain from Ronnie's bike. With a bold but measured step, she walked over to the tree and wrapped the chain around its trunk and hers. Then she had Ronnie lock his lock. "Now go get your mother," Pearl told him. "It's time for canasta." The ladies came and sat up under the tree. Ronnie played Pearl's hand for her. Soon it was lunchtime and everyone set up a buffet. Sue Lynn fed Pearl some cold sesame noodles and a Twinkie. "Are you all right?" the neighbors asked her. "Fine," she said. "I'll be here as long as it takes." People started leaning out their windows and coming down to see what was up. They brought music, baseballs, roller skates. It was the biggest party Ginkgo Street had ever seen. Finally, just as the sun was setting, TV cameras showed up and reporters interviewed Pearl. "I just want some justice," she told them. Of course, by then, the mayor had arrived in a long black limousine. "And it's justice you shall have," proclaimed the mayor. He called off the cutting down of the tree, and Pearl even made him promise to plant new ginkgos up and down the block. The neighbors cheered and set off fireworks long into the night. Pearl took the electrician and the mayor into her kitchen and gave them each a huge warm slice of noodle pudding. The mayor had seconds. "Go look. I think he renamed the street." What do you think he changed the name to? Pearl Street. All right, now all of our children and their teachers are going to go off to our classrooms.
Like some sunshine this morning, but everything is relative. This time last week, I was shoveling my way out of 27 inches of snow, the childhood home I grew up in, where my parents still live in New York. So, sometimes nice to go back. So this is one of the most beloved and well-known folk spirituals. No one knows its roots, but it probably came from African-American slave days. But it has such a wonderful, very, very bare-bones, simple message of strength and resilience that it was inevitably going to be picked up by other movements. So, with a line change to fit the movement. So it was widely sung during the labor movements in the 1930s, by the civil rights movement in the 60s, by the anti-Vietnam War protests in the 60s and 70s. May have found its way into some of the Occupy encampments, I don't know. But it definitely has legs. And like a lot of the folk spirituals, in each verse only one line is changed, which makes it easier for people to sing. People, right? Whoops. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Same thing again. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Old and young together, we shall not be moved. Old and young together, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Speaking up for human rights, we shall not be moved. Speaking up for human rights, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Standing on the side of love, we shall not be moved. Standing on the side of love, we shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved. Last chance. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved like a tree standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
Thanks, Richard. Let us join in a short time of silent meditation. Let our hearts be moved by the wisdom of the silence we share together. Namaste. Amen. And blessed be. All month I've been preaching about nonviolence, and the month has been a journey. Studying the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi was inspiring. Their philosophies of beloved community and satyagraha have offered visions of hope to our world. At the beginning of January, I started our discussion of nonviolence by recognizing that I have my doubts. I have doubts about how effective nonviolence is in achieving justice in our world. Today, I want to return to that original question about the effectiveness of nonviolence. Our Unitarian Universalist tradition expresses the ideal pretty loudly. I mean, we're spending a whole month on it. There's even a section dedicated to nonviolence in our hymnals. As I learned about our own Unitarian history this week, though, I uncovered a more complicated story. While we publicly celebrate the achievements of nonviolence, we oversimplify. I would even say we misunderstand our own history. We've remembered and retold our history in ways that lift up nonviolence. And I can't help but wonder why we dramatically downplay the role that violence has played in securing freedom in our country. So I invite you, as you listen to this sermon, to ask the question, why does the dominant culture lift up a story that nonviolence worked? Why do we so publicly embrace nonviolence when it's only part of our own history? Now, civil disobedience is the title of this sermon, and it's what started me down this rabbit hole of learning this week. Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, is the foundation for justice movements around the world. I can't adequately describe to you how influential it has been. Henry David Thoreau and his little intellectual circle were Unitarians, and though we often forget it, Unitarianism at that point was at the bedrock of our American history. So the essay actually started as a speech. In 1848, Henry David Thoreau delivered the speech titled "The Rights and Duties of the Individual in Relation to Government." It was printed 4 years after his death and given the name Civil Disobedience. So first and most simply, civil disobedience is kind of misunderstood from its title alone. Civil here is not a synonym for polite or kind or socially acceptable. Civil refers to government. Remember, Thoreau is that guy that spent a year out by the pond in that cabin growing his own food and mending his own clothes that no one really understood. Civil here refers to government. And the essay, Civil Disobedience, is a whole treatise on when and how people of conscience are responsible for defying the laws of their own government. Now, he took a very dim view of government. I didn't realize this until I looked into it more. He didn't just think that government was a little bit corrupt some of the time. He thought that all government was primarily an agent of corruption in our world. You're probably familiar with the phrase, that government is best which governs least. it comes from Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. Thoreau was disgusted by the institution of slavery and the brutal Mexican-American War. From his vantage point, the government enabled profound evils in this world. So that government which governs best governs least. To Thoreau, the government was a machine for corruption, and democracy had very little ability to correct the corruption of government. He pointed out that a majority, just because you have more people, doesn't mean that you bring on more wisdom or more sense of justice. Remember, slavery was a perfectly legal, democratically supported institution at the time. Because democracy is fundamentally unable to steer government toward justice, it rests on the conscience of each individual within society to leverage his or her own deeper wisdom. People of conscience are called to cease their cooperation with the machine of government wherever it is a weapon for injustice. That seems fairly familiar to us. It rings of the civil disobedience of the civil rights era, of violating segregation laws, buses, lunch counters, all of that bit. But Thoreau took the sense of breaking unjust laws to a dramatic level that we haven't seen since. In the case of the United States, he pointed out the Constitution itself enshrined the institution of slavery, and therefore falls under this same condemnation. Abolitionists, those opposed to slavery, should completely withdraw their support from the government by ceasing to pay taxes, even if it lands them in jail. Thoreau had a pretty deep awareness that refusing to cooperate with unjust laws came with serious material sacrifice. He wrote, "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison." In ways that resonate with Gandhi's life, Thoreau cultivated a sense of simplicity and independence. He pointed out pretty often that the more wealth you have, the more you need others, the more the government can punish you by taking it away. So it's better to learn to live with only what you need and free yourself from the ties of exploitation. So you land yourself in jail, all alone. What good does that do? Changing the system requires building a movement and encouraging people to work with you in an organized fashion, right? That's not what Thoreau would have said. He said, "Any man more right than his neighbor constitutes a majority already." He said, "I know this well, that if 1,000, if 100, if 10 honest men who I could name, if 10 men only, if one honest man in the state of Massachusetts, ceasing to hold slaves, were actually to withdraw from his co-partnership with the government and be locked up in the county jail, therefore, it would be the abolition of slavery in America." It doesn't matter how small the beginning seems, for what's done well once is done forever. In his essay, Thoreau describes the moral authority and the responsibility that we inherit. He insists that the discerning and performing right action changes our world. The words that I use in our theology today is that love transforms the world. That's a very quick summary of Henry David Thoreau's argument in Civil Disobedience, that government is a machine for corruption. It's the responsibility of individuals of conscience to resist that machine by refusing to cooperate. And our refusal is good. It creates change in the world. This document has been circulated through movements everywhere. It's been used to build justice in human communities, and it's part of our history. It's an amazing essay. It captures the moment in 1848 so eloquently. But Thoreau didn't end his intellectual life there. The country had a long, long way to go beyond 1848 to address the sin of slavery. It seems that sometimes we capture great leaders in a single moment. We forget the rest of their contributions so completely that we fundamentally misunderstand what they were about. I'm reminded of Miss Rosa Parks and the stories that we have about her. On December 1st, 1955, we have a picture of her coming up. Miss Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white passenger. As a result, she was arrested, and this sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. And that successful campaign became the symbol for the civil rights movement. Most of us know this story. It's a celebrated story. It's the story that we share with our children frequently. We lift her up for her bravery and her sacrifice. When we tell this one story about one moment in her life, though, we reduce her to a very safe hero to a white culture. I want to lift up some other details of Miss Parks's life that are no less heroic. They're details that we don't celebrate, details that many of us don't even know. Next picture. Malcolm X was Rosa Parks' personal hero. All her life, she believed in self-defense. As a child, when the Ku Klux Klan went on rampages through her childhood town, her grandfather would sit on the porch and hold vigil with his rifle at night. Rosa often stayed awake with him, keeping vigil. When she grew up, the Parks family kept a gun in their house, including during the boycott that she initiated with nonviolent resistance. They kept a gun because the daily terror of white violence was terrifying. We tell stories of Rosa Parks' arrest, and we kind of know that she went to jail. But after her arrest, she was continually threatened, so much so that her mother had to spend hours on the phone with her to tie up the lines because death threats came constantly on the home phone. She and her husband lost their jobs and didn't find full employment for another 10 years. Shortly after the bus boycotts, Parks moved with her family to Detroit, and she worked alongside the Black Power movement, particularly around issues of reparations, black history, anti-police brutality, freedom for black political prisoners, independent black political power, and economic justice. She even paid a visit to support the Black Panther School in Oakland, California. Next picture. Do you see this picture the same way now? Much of the memorializing of the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement fails to understand Miss Rosa Parks. Think for just a moment about why a dominant white culture has painted such a lifeless and meek portrait of a revolutionary black woman. I think we've also participated in a similar whitewashing of our own Unitarian history. Henry David Thoreau wrote the celebrated essay Civil Disobedience in 1848. To this day, it serves as a foundation for nonviolent resistance and movements for social change. In our own tradition, he was a brilliant man, and his contemporaries were too. What I discovered this week, though, as I read a little more about that period of our history, was that a lot of change was occurring in that crowd of friends. As the government became more complicit with the evils of slavery, and as they developed personal relationships with freed and runaway slaves, their commitment deepened to the point of embracing violence. In the early 1850s, Thoreau's friends in Boston were emboldened by the newly passed Fugitive Slave Act. They were so upset, they formed a committee to temporarily provide shelter and eventually help runaway slaves escape the country. A couple of attempts succeeded. 2 attempts, though, did not succeed, and these were pretty important for Thoreau. In 1851, Thomas Sims was returned to slavery, and Thoreau wrote in his journal, "I wish to consider this, who the man was, whether he was Jesus Christ or another. For inasmuch as ye did it unto the least of his brethren, ye did it unto me. Do you think Jesus would have stayed here in liberty and let a black man go into slavery in his stead?" 3 years later, in May of 1854, another Virginian, Anthony Burns, was arrested as a runaway in Boston. A crowd of angry abolitionists actually gathered to watch as he was given back to his owner. That was a turning point for Thoreau. In a speech about the event, Thoreau said, "My thoughts are murder to the state." Later in his journal, he wrote the words, "I'm calculating how many miscreants each honest man can dispose of." In 1859, a flashpoint erupted in American history. The abolitionist John Brown initiated an armed slave revolt as he tried to overtake the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was joined there by 20 men, both slave and free. The revolt was soundly defeated, but it was well organized, it was well funded. People read this and they knew something was in the air. Now, we forget this, but several Unitarians knew John Brown personally. Some of them were the biggest funders of his revolt. A lot of people were killed in that battle, but John Brown survived and was captured. Now, at first, the Northerners, as they read the news of this revolt, they thought it was a wild mess. Even anti-slavery advocates condemned it as misguided and wild and crazy, but Thoreau had a different story. He had a different take on it. He said, "No man in America has ever stood up so persistently and effectively for the dignity of human nature." He said that Brown was the most American of us all. In October of 1859, this Unitarian circle cemented their radical stance by being the first in the country to embrace John Brown and his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Now, the details are way too numerous and way too complex to cover in one short sermon, but just as Henry David Thoreau articulated a blueprint for nonviolent disobedience, so did he and his fellow Unitarian public figures usher in the moral justification for the Civil War. So, in closing, I ask you again, why do we tell the story that we tell? Why do we so publicly embrace the role of nonviolence when it's only one part of our country's journey toward justice? There's great truth in the aphorism that history is written by the victors. The white privileged majority has largely shaped our understanding of American history. The stories that we tell, the stories that we remember, are the stories that the white community has chosen to embrace. My hunch is that as we still live in the midst of racial inequality, it's much more comfortable for people of privilege to embrace stories of nonviolence. While nonviolence is a beautiful, personal, spiritual practice, and it can be very politically powerful, it was not enough to rid us of the original sin of slavery. Our whitewashing carries into the 20th century and our misunderstanding of the civil rights movement. By the late 1960s, most black leaders have moved far beyond King's beloved community. Along with Miss Rosa Parks, they sought real, material black power, even if that had to be taken by force. Nonviolence is a beautiful part of our Unitarian tradition and our nation's journey toward justice, but it's only a part of the story. To honor the struggles of marginalized communities, we have to acknowledge that physical force was necessary and it was effective. If we hope to disentangle ourselves from white supremacy, we should take a long, hard look before condemning the methods of another community and its journey toward justice. Amen. We extinguish our chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we're together again. And would you take the hand of someone near you for our benediction? As we leave this hallowed place, may our feet remember its feel, so that wherever we walk, we know ourselves to be on hallowed ground. May we know that we're kin with every soul, every star, every stone, and leaf of grass. And go in peace and let the light within you be a blessing to the world.